Inside her Virginia cottage, 25-year-old Margot Eloise Sable stared at a bank draft for the exact debt threatening her home. The man who brought it looked like a working farmer. That was the first contradiction. Her father was ill. Denton Crayle had given them little room left to resist. Yet this stranger knew the debt precisely, had the money ready, and offered to erase it for one price: marriage. Margot studied the draft, then the man holding out salvation. A poor farmer should not have been able to produce that sum so easily. More troubling, he seemed to know far too much about the man collecting it. By dawn, desperation had become a decision. Margot married him in a small chapel. Only when she signed the register did she see the full name beside hers: Colton Breck. Then another contradiction waited outside. Not a farm wagon, but an enclosed carriage prepared for a journey west. As they traveled, Margot began testing every detail she had accepted the night before. Colton admitted he had studied Crayle. His clothes were plain, but too well made for the life he claimed. His manner had none of the uncertainty of a man spending his last money. Then the carriage slowed before wrought iron gates. A uniformed gatekeeper recognized Colton immediately. The gates opened. Beyond them stood Breck Hollow, a vast Virginia estate. Servants were already waiting at the manor steps. Margot stepped down with one small bag and her mother's Bible. A silver-haired butler descended to meet her, bowed, and said, "Welcome home, Mom." Margot looked back at the mud-marked boots, worn coat, and quiet man she had agreed to marry. She had thought Colton was a poor farmer with enough money to save her father. He was the master of Breck Hollow, and the bank draft had been ready before he ever came to her door. So why had a wealthy man needed Margot to believe he was poor before she said yes? The debt was impossible. The stranger at her door was not. Margot Sable had one night to save her dying father from ruin, and only one offer on the table. A rough-looking farmer, a bank draft with the exact figure she owed, a proposal that made no sense. Marry him, leave by morning, ask questions later. The village laughed when she accepted. They said desperation had made her foolish. They said a poor farmer was the best a ruined girl could do. But when the carriage stopped that evening and the iron gates swung open, and the servants lined the steps of a great stone manor glowing gold through the mist, the butler bowed, and the words he spoke changed everything. "Welcome home, ma'am." Margot turned slowly to the man in the worn coat and the muddied boots, the man who had said he was a farmer, the man she had married at dawn. He was already watching her, and he did not look surprised at all. The rain came without apology. It pressed against the windows of the Sable cottage in long silver sheets, drumming against the cracked sill, slipping through the gap above the front door, and tapping steadily into the tin basin set beneath the leak in the ceiling. The sound of it had become so familiar over the past months that Margot Eloise Sable barely noticed it anymore. What she noticed was the fire, how low it burned, how little wood remained beside the grate, and how the cold crept across the floor like something alive, searching for ankles. She was 25 years old. She had been poor for 3 of those years, but she had only started to feel it in her bones this winter. Margot stood at the window with her arms folded across her chest, her breath fogging the glass. Through the distortion of rain and cold, she could see the black shape of a carriage at the end of the lane. It had not moved in 10 minutes. It simply sat there, patient and dark, like an omen wearing wheels. She already knew who was inside it. Behind her, in the narrow back room, her father was sleeping. Harlan Elias Sable, once a careful man, a respected estate clerk, a person of small but real dignity, now lay in a bed that had grown too wide for his shrinking frame. Illness had taken his strength first, then his position, then his reputation. The debts had come after, the way scavengers come after storms. One misfortune, then another, until the name Sable meant nothing in the valley except the sound of failure. Margot heard the carriage door open. She did not move from the window. She watched Denton Crayle step down onto the muddy lane, his boots protected by leather gaiters, his coat perfectly pressed despite the weather. He was a man built for the appearance of authority. Broad shoulders, a silver-handled cane, a black leather case tucked under one arm as though it contained documents and not daggers. He glanced up at the cottage with the expression of a man who had already decided what he would find inside it. Margot exhaled slowly. She straightened her spine. She smoothed her dress with both hands, the gray wool one, the only one still presentable, and she moved to the door before he could knock twice. When she opened it, Crayle smiled. It was the kind of smile that cost nothing and meant less. "Miss Sable," he said pleasantly. "What a grim evening." "Come in," she said, because there was no use pretending he was not there. He stepped inside without wiping his boots. He set his leather case on the small table near the hearth, as though it belonged to him already, and he opened it with the careful movements of a man who understood that slowness was its own kind of cruelty. Inside, Margot could see rows of folded papers, letters, notices, ledger copies, all arranged with the precision of a man who took pleasure in order. "I will save us both the performance," Margot said, keeping her voice level. "Tell me how much." Crayle looked up at her. His smile shifted slightly, appreciating the directness, she suspected, because it meant he did not have to pretend to be sorry. He named the figure. The number landed in Margot's chest like a stone dropped into still water. It sent ripples all the way to her fingertips. She felt the room tilt slightly, the way rooms tilt when the world just reminds you just how small your standing in it truly is. She kept her face still. She had learned that much. "That cannot be the full amount," she said. "My father's records show a figure considerably less than that." "Your father's records," Crayle interrupted gently, "are not the records I hold. The interest has accumulated, Miss Sable. The leases on the land rights have lapsed. There are administrative fees attached to each notice of delay." He paused to let her absorb that. "In total, you have 7 days to produce the full sum, or the cottage, the furniture, the land use rights, and any remaining property of value will be seized in settlement." Margot stared at him. She was thinking of the medicine bottle on the shelf behind her, empty since Tuesday. She was thinking of the 3 books she had not yet sold, because they had been her mother's. She was thinking of the basin in the back room where she had sat through the night last week, wringing out cool cloths for her father's fever. "And the books?" she asked, because it was the only thing she could think to say that was smaller than the real question burning through her. "Everything, Miss Sable." Crayle closed his leather case with a quiet click. "There are other arrangements available to women in difficult positions, of course. Private arrangements." He did not look at her when he said it. He straightened his gloves. "I only mention it as a practical consideration." The fire popped behind her. "Get out," Margot said. Her voice did not shake. That surprised even her. Crayle gathered his case with no visible hurry and moved toward the door. He stopped on the threshold, pulling his coat collar up against the rain. 7 days, Miss Sable. I will return at noon." He walked back to the carriage. The door closed. The black shape moved away through the rain. Margot stood in the doorway a moment longer than she should have, letting the cold cut across her face, letting it steady her. Then she turned and walked to her father's room. Harlan Sable was awake. He was lying on his side, his eyes open, watching the door. He had heard everything. She could see it in the careful way he held his face, the way people hold their faces when they are trying not to cause more pain than the situation already contains. "Margot," he said quietly. "Rest," she said. She pulled the blanket higher across his chest. "Do not speak. I have failed you," he said, because he had been carrying those words all evening and could not hold them any longer. Margot sat on the edge of the bed. She took his hand, thin now, the knuckles sharp beneath the skin, and she held it in both of hers. "You raised me," she said. "You educated me, when other men would not have bothered with a daughter. You read to me and taught me figures and told me the world was wider than this valley." She looked at him directly. "That is not failure. That is the only inheritance that matters." Harlan closed his eyes. A tear traced the side of his face and disappeared into the pillow. Margot sat with him until his breathing evened into sleep. Then she rose, moved back to the main room, and stood at the table where Crayle had set his leather case. 7 days. She looked at the empty medicine bottle. She looked at the cracked ceiling. She looked at the tin basin, now nearly full, and listened to the rhythm of the rain. She did not allow herself to weep. Weeping solved nothing. What she needed was a number far larger than anything she could produce in 7 days. And a miracle. And she had stopped believing in miracles, sometime around the second winter of her father's illness. A knock at the door. She turned. The sound was different from Crayle's knock. Crayle's knock had been three sharp, confident raps, the sound of a man who knew he would be let in. This knock was quieter. Two strikes, measured, almost considerate. Margot crossed to the door and opened it. The man outside was tall and wide across the shoulders, dressed in a coat that had seen better years. The collar was turned up, the fabric dark with rain. His boots were worn at the heels. His hands, visible where they hung at his sides, were calloused and roughened by outdoor work. He wore a plain hat pulled low, and the lamplight from behind her caught his face just enough for her to see it. He was not old. Somewhere in his middle 30s, she guessed. His jaw was set in a way that suggested he was not accustomed to doubt. His eyes were gray, or perhaps green in better light, but they were steady in a way she had rarely encountered. Not friendly, not cold. Simply attentive, as though he was already several thoughts ahead of the conversation. "Miss Sable," he said. She had never met this man in her life, yet he knew her name. "Who are you?" she asked. "My name is Colton," he said. "I have a proposition." She almost closed the door. Propositions from strangers on rain-soaked evenings, appearing within minutes of debt collectors. There was nothing in that sentence that invited trust, but something in the quality of his stillness held her. He did not lean forward. He did not shift his weight. He simply stood in the rain and waited, as though he had all the patience in the world and no intention of wasting it on performances. "You had better come in," she said. He stepped inside. He removed his hat. He did not look around the cottage the way some visitors did, noting the poverty, cataloging the lack. He simply looked at her. "How much does your father owe?" he asked. Margot felt the hairs on her arms rise beneath her sleeves. "How do you know my father owes anything?" she said carefully. "Because I know Crayle," Colton answered, "and I know the roads he travels." He paused. "How much?" She told him the number, the same number that had driven the breath from her chest an hour ago. She said it plainly, watching his face. His expression did not change. He reached into his coat and produced a bank draft. He set it on the table. Margot looked at it. She looked at him. She looked back at it. The number on the draft was exact, down to the last penny. Her heart beat faster. Her mind moved quickly, calculating, testing. A poor farmer did not carry bank drafts. A poor farmer did not have that sum available at all, much less already written out. A poor farmer did not appear on her doorstep within an hour of Denton Crayle's departure, as though the visit had been scheduled. "What do you want?" she asked, because the question underneath all the others was always that one. "I want a wife," he said simply. The fire crackled. Margot looked at him for a long measuring moment. "You want to marry a woman you have never met," she said. "On the evening a debt collector threatened to seize everything she owns." "Yes. That is not a proposition. That is an ambush." The faintest line appeared at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one. "I prefer to call it an opportunity," he said, "for both of us." "What do you receive from it?" she asked, because she was her father's daughter, and her father had taught her that every transaction had two sides. "A wife," he repeated, "one who is not afraid of difficulty, one who keeps her head under pressure, one who does not break when a man like Crayle tries to make her feel small." He paused, and something moved in his gray eyes that was more complex than the words he had chosen. "I watched you this evening, Miss Sable. When Crayle left, you did not cry. You did not beg. You closed the door and went to your father." The chill that moved across her had nothing to do with bold. "You followed me," she said quietly. "I observed," he said. "There is a difference." She wanted to argue that point, but the bank draft was on the table and the medicine bottle was empty, and her father was sleeping through the most important decision of her life. "If I agree," she said slowly, "my father receives proper care, a physician, medicine, someone to look after him while I am gone." "Agreed," he said immediately. "I have conditions of my own. I expected you would, and if I refuse." He reached forward and picked the bank draft off the table. He folded it and returned it to his coat. "Then I will trouble you no further," he said, "and I will find someone else." He moved toward the door. Margot's throat tightened. She thought of her father's hand in hers, thin, light, worn to almost nothing by a year of illness. She thought of what Crayle had implied, of the word arrangements spoken in that polished, casual voice. She thought of 7 days, and of an empty shelf where the medicine had been. The old chapel, she said to his back. Dawn. Colton paused with one hand on the door. He turned to look at her over his shoulder. His expression was difficult to read, but she thought for just a moment that beneath the careful stillness of it, something eased. Dawn, he agreed. He stepped back into the rain. The door closed. The lamp guttered in the draught. Margot stood alone in the cottage with the sound of the basin filling steadily in the corner and the low, dying breath of the fire. And she looked at the table where the bank draft had been. She went to her father's room. She sat beside him in the dark. She listened to his breathing. He had told her once, when she was small and afraid of the dark, that courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision that something else matters more. She had not truly understood it until tonight. By dawn, Margot Sable would be either a daughter watching her world collapse or a wife to a stranger she did not understand. She had never been more afraid in her life. She had never been more certain. Margot did not sleep. She sat beside her father's bed through the dark hours and let the silence of the cottage press around her. Once, her father stirred and opened his eyes, and she took his hand and told him softly that everything was all right. She said it with the steady conviction of someone who has decided that the truth is less useful than the comfort. And sometimes that decision is its own kind of love. Harlan Sable was not easily deceived by his daughter. He pulled her hand toward him and held it against his chest. She felt the uneven rhythm of his breathing beneath her palm. "I heard what you said to him," Harlan whispered. "At the door. The chapel at dawn. He said, 'Margot, you cannot sell yourself for me.'" His voice was thin but stubborn, the way old iron goes thin at the edges before it holds the longest. No father should purchase his life at the cost of his daughter's freedom. "Then stop thinking of it as a cost," Margot said. "Think of it as a choice. My choice, made with full knowledge." She looked at him steadily. "Poverty has taken choices from me one by one for 3 years. This is the first time I have had one that matters." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he exhaled slowly, a long, resigned sound, and he said, "Then listen to me." She listened. Harlan Sable, even weakened by illness, had the mind of a man who had spent his life working among accounts and documents and the subtle legalities of estate management. He spoke slowly, choosing each word. "Keep something hidden. Even a small sum set aside before they know to ask for it. Learn the house. Every door, every ledger, every servant's name and loyalty. Watch carefully. Trust slowly. Never forget that a bargain does not erase the person making it. And take the packet in the desk drawer. Take it with you and keep it safe. It may mean nothing, but keep it safe." Margot opened the desk drawer in the gray hours before dawn. Inside, among folded receipts and careful notes in her father's precise hand, was a thick packet of papers tied with brown string. She recognized some of the notations, estate figures, names, dates, but she did not stop to read them. She wrapped them carefully inside her mother's old Bible and tucked both into the small bag she was taking with her. 2 dresses, the sewing kit, the Bible, the papers. A ribbon her mother had worn in her hair, pale blue and slightly frayed at the edges. She looked around the cottage one last time in the thin gray light of almost morning. It was the only home she had known since childhood. The walls were cracked and the roof leaked, and the fire had never quite been warm enough this winter. But it held every memory she possessed. Her mother at the kitchen table, her father reading by the window, the smell of cold smoke and old books. She closed the door quietly behind her. The morning was cold and still the rain from the night, before leaving the lane dark and gleaming. She walked through the village with her bag over her arm, and the village was already awake. She felt the eyes. She heard the curtains shift. She saw the shape of a woman in an upstairs window, saw the farrier's apprentice pause with a bucket in each hand watching her pass. She heard a low voice from the direction of the post house, not the words, only the tone that meant someone was being discussed and found wanting. She kept walking. She kept her chin level, her shoulders back, her pace unhurried. If they wanted to watch, they would see her walk through their village with her spine straight and her dignity intact. And they could say whatever they liked after she was gone. Colton was waiting outside the old chapel. He had changed from the rain-soaked coat of the night before. He wore a plain dark waistcoat and a simple gray cravat, the clothing of a respectable working man. Not a gentleman, but cleaner and better fitted than she might have expected. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back watching the lane, and when he saw her coming, he did not smile or move forward. He simply watched her walk toward him with the same attentive stillness she had noticed the night before. The minister was already inside. There was a single witness, an old man Margot did not recognize, someone Colton had brought. No flowers, no music, no assembled guests. The ceremony was brief and entirely without ceremony. When the minister asked if she, Margot Sable, took this man to be her lawful husband, she heard her own voice answer clearly, without trembling, and she felt as though she were watching herself from a small distance. As though the girl who had grown up in this valley, who had been educated by a careful father and mourned a gentle mother, was being quietly folded away. What remained was someone she had not yet named. Colton signed the register. Margot leaned to read the signature. Colton Ashford Breck. She had not thought to ask his surname before this moment. It struck her, standing in a cold stone chapel at dawn, that she had agreed to marry a man whose full name she did not know. She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the register. Outside, as the minister closed the chapel, Margot said, "Where exactly is your farm, Mr. Breck?" "Beyond the western road," Colton answered. He took her bag from her hand before she could object. A small, practical gesture that startled her with its ease. "Is it far?" she asked. "Far enough that no one reaches it by accident." That answer did not comfort her. The carriage waiting at the edge of the lane was not a farm cart. It was covered and enclosed, with properly sprung axles and dark polished wood on the door. The exterior was plain, deliberately so, she would later understand. But when Colton opened the door and handed her up inside, she felt the quality of the cushioning beneath her and understood that whoever paid for this vehicle had paid considerably. She said nothing. She sat across from him as the carriage moved out of the valley, and she watched the place she had grown up in slide past the window and disappear around a bend in the lane. She allowed herself one moment, one small, private moment of grief for everything she was leaving. Then she looked at the man sitting opposite her. He was watching the window, his hands resting on his knees, perfectly still. His posture was too controlled for a man who had grown up doing field work. His jaw was set in that same quietly authoritative way. His coat, she noticed now, was plain but well made. Not the fabric of poverty, but the fabric of someone who had chosen deliberately not to appear wealthy. "You know Crayle," she said. He turned from the window. "Yes." "How?" A pause, brief but deliberate. "He does work for certain landowners in this county. I am familiar with his methods. And my father's debt," she said. "You knew the exact figure down to the last penny. You had the bank draft already written." She kept her voice even. "That means you were prepared before you came to my door, which means you had decided to offer for me before you knocked, which means you know more about me than you have told." The carriage moved through a quiet stretch of road. The hedges on either side grew taller. The fields beyond them were well-kept, almost too well-kept for this part of the county. She filed that detail away. "I will answer your questions in full," Colton said, "when we arrive." "I would prefer some answers now," Margot said. His eyes met hers. In the pale morning light inside the carriage, they were clearly gray, a deep clear gray with something darker underneath, like still water over rock. There was intelligence in them and something else. Something that sat behind the composed surface of him, like a fire visible through frosted glass. "I know that you are brave," he said, "that you are practical, that you manage desperation without losing yourself in it." He paused. "Those qualities are rarer than you know, Miss Sable." "Breck," she said, because the correction seemed important. Something shifted almost imperceptibly at the corner of his mouth. "Mrs. Breck," he said. The carriage jolted over a rough section of road, a deep rut from the night's rain, and Margot was thrown slightly sideways. She felt his hand close around her wrist immediately, steadying her. The grip was firm and warm and absolutely certain of itself, the grip of a man who moves without hesitation when a thing needs to be done. He released her the instant she had regained her balance. The warmth of his hand remained on her wrist for several seconds after. She did not look at him. She looked out the window instead. "Forgive me," he said. "For catching me," she said carefully. "Or for hiding something." He did not answer. She watched the landscape change outside the window. The lane narrowed, then smoothed out. The trees grew thicker on either side. She caught glimpses through the branches of what looked like managed parkland. The grass, too, even for wild country. They passed a small gatehouse, and she noticed that the gate stood open, as though someone had been informed they were coming. The carriage slowed. Ancient oak trees lined the last stretch of the drive, their trunks twisted with age, their branches creating a dark green tunnel through which the pale sky barely showed. At the end of the tunnel, wrought iron gates stood between two stone pillars topped with a carved crest. A gatekeeper stepped from the small lodge beside the pillar. He was an older man in a coat that was clearly a uniform. He looked at the carriage. He looked at Colton through the window. He bowed. Then he opened the gates. Margot sat very still. Through the iron gates, a long gravel drive curved through open parkland toward a house. Not a house, a manor. A great stone manor with towers at its corners and carved stone above its windows and lanterns still burning along the approach, golden against the pale morning. The windows were tall and wide, and the ivy across the north wing was a deep burning October red. Figures were visible at the top of the steps, a row of figures in dark clothing standing in perfect stillness. Servants waiting. "Colton," Margot said. It was the first time she had used his name without a title. He did not seem to notice, or perhaps he noticed everything. "We are nearly there," he said. The carriage came to a stop at the base of the manor steps. A footman moved to open the door. Colton descended first, then turned and offered his hand. Margot took it. She stepped down onto the gravel in her gray wool dress, with her small bag of 2 dresses and a Bible, and she looked up the steps at the assembled household, at the butler, tall and silver-haired, at the housekeeper, with her keys at her waist, at the row of maids and footmen in their dark livery, and she felt the full vertiginous weight of what she had walked into. The butler descended 2 steps and bowed deeply. "Welcome home, ma'am," he said, not to the carriage, not to the air between them. To Colton. Margot turned very slowly and looked at the man beside her. He had removed his plain hat. He stood on the gravel of his own manor in his deliberately worn coat and his rough farmer's boots. And he looked at her with an expression that was sleazy and watchful and braced for what she was about to say. He was waiting. He had been waiting since she opened her cottage door. "Ma'am," Margot said quietly. She said it like a question, like an accusation, like the first word of a sentence she had not yet found the rest of. She looked at the manor. She looked at the servants. She looked at the man she had married at dawn in a cold stone chapel, who had signed his name in a register as Breck, and failed to mention the word that came before it. Colton said, "I will explain everything." "Yes," Margot said, with a steadiness that cost her considerably. "You will." Breck Hollow was everything that the valley was not. It was tall and pale and ancient and certain of itself, the way very old wealth always is. Not boastful, but absolute, like a mountain that has simply always been there and sees no reason to apologize for its height. The entrance hall was marble-floored with portraits, watching from gilded frames, and a chandelier overhead that caught the morning light and scattered it in cold, brilliant fragments across the walls. The butler, his name was Fenwick Greer, had guided her through the entrance hall with a careful, expressionless professionalism that told her he had done difficult things quietly for a very long time. Behind him, the housekeeper, Mrs. Opal Greer, had greeted her with a warm practicality that felt almost kind, if cautious. Margot stood in the center of a bedroom that was larger than the entirety of the Sable cottage. The bed had 4 posts and heavy silk drapes in deep blue. The fireplace was marble, with carved flowers along the mantel. Through 2 tall windows, she could see a garden dormant with autumn, but laid out in formal geometric patterns that spoke of considerable care and expense. She sat on the edge of the bed, set her bag on the floor, and folded her hands in her lap. She was the wife of the wealthiest landowner in the county. She let that sentence exist in her mind for a moment, without trying to make sense of it. She turned it over. She examined it from several angles. She found that from every angle it was equally incomprehensible. So she set it aside and focused on what she knew. She knew that the man she had married was not a farmer, She knew that he had disguised himself deliberately. She knew that he had watched her before approaching her. She knew that he had a specific reason for wanting a wife urgently, and that reason was connected to something more complicated than loneliness. She also knew, and this was the part that made her chest tighten, that she had believed him to be poor and had entered the bargain on those terms, and that the terms had shifted considerably without her consent. There was a knock at the bedroom door. "Come in," she said. Colton entered. He had changed. He was in different clothes now, still quietly dressed without ostentation, but the quality of the fabric was apparent, and the fit spoke of a tailor who understood his craft. Without the rough coat and worn boots, without the deliberate costuming of poverty, he was unmistakably a man born to a certain kind of room. He crossed to the chair near the fireplace and sat. He did not look comfortable, but he looked resolved. "You lied to me," Margot said. "I concealed my position," he said. "I did not lie about saving your father. I did not lie about the marriage. I did not lie about giving you a secure home. You permitted me to believe I was marrying a poor farmer," she said. "You allowed me to make that decision based on false information. If I had told you I was the master of Breck Hollow," he said, "what would you have assumed? What would every woman in a difficult position assume if a wealthy man appeared at her door and offered to save her?" He paused. They would assume he wanted something shameful, or they would want his wealth so desperately that they would agree to anything. Either way, the truth of the person would be lost. He looked at her steadily. "I needed to know who you were before you knew who I was." Margot was quiet. She turned that logic over carefully. It was not irrational. It was deliberate and even principled in its cold, strategic way. That did not mean she was not angry about it. "Why me?" she asked. "I watched you for 3 days before I came to your door," he said. "I saw you manage your father's care without complaint. I saw you sell your books to pay for his medicine and never once let him see it cost you anything. I saw you stand before Crayle and not tremble." He met her eyes. "I did not choose you out of pity. I chose you because I needed someone who does not break under pressure. And you had spent 3 years proving you were exactly that person." Margot felt the words move through her in a complicated way. Part of her acknowledged the truth in them. Part of her resented being assessed like a candidate for a position she had not applied for. "And the enemies you mentioned," she said. "Tell me about them," he told her. His name was Colton Breck, master of Breck Hollow, the largest estate in this part of Virginia. His father, Orland Breck, had died 14 months ago. Since then, his uncle, Jasper Breck, had been pressing claims that Colton was unfit to manage the estate, citing his withdrawal from society after his father's death, his preference for the fields over the parlor, his lack of a wife, and a series of financial irregularities that Jasper attributed to Colton's neglect. Alongside Jasper was a cousin, Merritt Lowe, who had a legal mind and a talent for paperwork, and who had spent the past year preparing documents that would, if presented at a formal estate hearing, make it possible to remove Colton from active control and place Breck Hollow under a council of management. There was also a woman, Lenora Voss, a widow of good family and considerable ambition, who had once been positioned as a possible wife for Colton, and who had not taken kindly to being passed over. She had spent several months circulating careful, elegant rumors that Colton was unstable, reclusive, and possibly not competent to hold the estate. A married man, by contrast, was a settled man. A man with a wife beside him at estate hearings appeared capable of managing his responsibilities. Jasper's legal case became considerably thinner if Colton presented himself as a man in full command of his life. "So you married me," Margot said slowly, "to defend your estate." "Partly," he said. He was quiet for a moment. His eyes moved to the window. "The other part," Hardy explained simply. She waited. "I have been surrounded for 14 months by people who want something from me," he said. "Relatives who want control. Society women who want position. Magistrates who want influence." He paused. "You wanted none of those things from me. You did not even know they existed." He turned from the window. "There was something in that I found I could not stop thinking about." Margot looked at him for a long moment. She thought of the warmth of his hand when he caught her wrist in the carriage. She thought of the bank draft already written, the number already known. I have conditions, she said. Name them. She named them clearly, and in order, the way her father had taught her to present any arrangement of importance, without hedging, without apology. Her father must receive care immediately. A physician sent that same day. She must have the freedom to write to him and receive his replies without interference. She must have her own household allowance, independent of Colton's approval. She must have privacy, genuinely private rooms, genuinely private hours. She must have the right to ask direct questions and receive direct answers. And the marriage must be understood as a partnership, not as ownership. She paused. Then she added one final condition, watching his face carefully as she spoke. She must have full access to every financial ledger on the estate. Every account, every record, every transaction. Colton's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. It was the first time she had seen him hesitate. The stillness that followed was different from his usual composure. It was the stillness of a man weighing something against something else. Then he said, agreed. She had expected negotiation on that last point. Some modification of terms, some pushback on the ledgers at least. He had said agreed before she finished drawing breath. That told her something. She was not sure yet what it told her, but she stored it carefully alongside every other detail she was collecting about this man and this house, and the distance between what she had been told and what was true. That night, after the household had settled into darkness and the corridors had gone quiet, Margot sat on the edge of her bed and opened her father's papers. She spread them carefully across the silk bed cover and read by candlelight, her fingers tracing the careful notations in Harlan Sable's precise hand. Estate figures, property designations, lease numbers, dates going back nearly a decade. And besides certain entries written small but unmistakable in her father's handwriting, 3 names appeared again and again, always adjacent to numbers that did not reconcile, always marking the places where something had gone wrong and someone had tried to make it look right. Crayle, J. Breck, Lowe. Margot stared at those names for a long time. The candle flame bent slightly in a draft from the tall window, and the shadows on the wall shifted and resettled. Her father had not been ruined by misfortune. Her father had been ruined by design. He had found something in these accounts, something that connected the man who had come to collect his debt, the uncle who was trying to steal this estate, and the cousin who was building the legal case to do it, and they had destroyed him to bury what he knew. She folded the papers carefully. She placed them back inside her mother's Bible. She closed the cover and held it against her chest for a moment, feeling the weight of it, the worn leather, the thin pages, the ribbon marking a verse her mother had read to her as a child. Then she placed the Bible at the bottom of her bag, beneath the second dress, where no one would think to look. She blew out the candle. She lay in the enormous bed, in the enormous room, in the house of a man she had married 12 hours ago, and she stared at the ceiling in the dark, and she began to understand the shape of what she had walked into. Not a rescue, not a bargain, a battlefield, and somewhere in her father's careful papers was the map. Breck Hollow did not wake gently. It woke with purpose and precision, bells ringing at specific intervals, footsteps in corridors following rhythms that had operated for generations without interruption, fires laid before dawn in rooms that would not be used until mid-morning. Margot was standing at her window when the first light came, watching the stable yard below fill with the purposeful quiet of men who knew their work. She had been awake for an hour, turning her father's papers over in her mind, and the 3 names written beside the numbers that did not reconcile had not changed their meaning overnight. If anything, the meaning had sharpened. Mrs. Opal Greer came for her after breakfast. She was a compact, efficient woman with sharp eyes and a warmth she expressed through practicality rather than sentiment. She showed Margot where things were, explained who answered to whom, told her which servants were long-standing and loyal, and which were newer and should be watched. She was not gossipy. She was precise the way a woman who has managed a complicated household for 20 years learns to be precise. Mr. Breck has been managing Breck Hollow alone since his father's death, Opal said, guiding Margot through the estate office at the west end of the main floor. He has kept the household functioning, but there are pressures he has not been able to address. What kind of pressures? Margot asked. Tenant complaints primarily. 3 families in the Eastern Holdings have received notices of debt they say they do not owe. One family was asked to vacate a cottage they have leased for 30 years. Opal paused at the office door with the particular expression of someone deciding how much trust to extend. The notices bear Mr. Crayle's seal. Margot kept her face still. Crayle administers estate accounts, she said. Certain accounts, an arrangement made several years ago, before the old Mr. Breck died. Jasper Breck arranged it. Opal opened the office door, and Margot stepped inside. The estate office was a large, practical room lined with shelves of ledgers, current accounts, historical records, tenant files going back decades. Maps of the holdings rolled in tubes along the upper shelf. A heavy oak desk sat before the window with an inkstand, and 3 boxes of correspondence. Margot crossed to the shelves. She pulled a current account book and opened it to the most recent entries. She was not an accountant, but she had grown up in a household where money was carefully tracked, and she had spent 3 years managing what little they had, with a precision that left no room for error. She understood the basic grammar of a ledger, what a healthy one looked like, and what a healthy one did not. One entry caught her eye within the first 5 minutes. A tenant payment marked received for the Alderton family, with a sum 3 times what any reasonable holding in this county should generate. The date on it was 2 weeks after the corresponding lease in the adjacent file had been marked transfer. A family had lost their lease. Their land had moved somewhere else, and in the account book, a large payment had been registered as though everything had resolved smoothly. It had not resolved smoothly. Someone had profited, and the profit had been dressed in the ordinary clothing of routine bookkeeping. She closed the ledger carefully and replaced it. She had what she needed from this room for now, and spending more time here risked drawing attention she was not yet ready for. She found Colton before noon, not in the library but at the stables, speaking with the farrier about a draft horse with a cracked hoof. He looked up when she approached, and she saw the slight tension in his posture when he noticed what she was carrying. Her father's papers. The packet unfolded in her hands. "Walk with me," she said. They walked the eastern boundary of the estate together, following the fence line past the timber stands and the first cluster of tenant cottages. Colton talked as they walked, and for the first time he talked without careful management. He showed her the structure of Breck Hollow, not through ledgers, but through the land itself. 10 tenant farms, the timber rights along the northern ridge, the mill leases on the creek, the horse breeding program his father had built over 2 decades, the agricultural reforms Orland Breck had begun and that Colton had been trying to continue alone. New rotation methods on the eastern farms. A drainage project on the western lowland. Improvements to the mill leases that would benefit both the estate and the families dependent on them. Margot listened, but she was also watching. The stables were well built, but held fewer horses than their size suggested. The mill was operating, but the account figures she had seen that morning did not match the output she could see. The tenant cottages were tended with care, but the families who emerged to greet Colton did so with an undercurrent of worry that had nothing to do with the season. The estate was not in ruin. It was rich and healthy beneath the surface. But it was bleeding, steadily, quietly, in amounts small enough not to raise immediate alarm, but large enough, accumulated over 3 years, to be significant. Someone had been draining it with purpose, and the drainage was designed to look like natural decline. At the last tenant holding on the eastern line, a man named Wyatt Fenton came out to meet them. He was in his 50s, lean from decades of fieldwork, and he shook Colton's hand with the automatic respect of a man who has worked the same land under 2 generations of the same family. But when Colton introduced Margot, something shifted in Fenn's expression. He looked at her, then at the ground, then at the barn behind him where the doors stood open on empty stalls. Fenn had lost 4 horses in the past year, not to disease or injury, to sale. Crayle had come to him with a document showing an outstanding fee for grazing rights, a fee Fenn had never been charged before. The amount was significant enough that Fenn could not pay it outright, and Crayle had offered an alternative. The horses could be sold through the estate's account. The fee would be settled, and Fenn would receive the balance. Fenn had agreed because there was no other option visible to him. But the balance had never arrived. When he inquired, Crayle told him the sale price had the fee exactly, with nothing remaining. 4 horses bred on this land, worth considerably more than any grazing fee, simply gone. Margot asked him if he had the original document Crayle had presented. He did. She asked if she could borrow it. He looked at Colton. Colton nodded. Ben went inside and came back with a folded paper that Margot placed carefully inside the Bible she carried in her bag. On the walk back to the house, Colton was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I did not know about the horses." "That is the point," Margot said. "You were not meant to know. Each theft is small enough to seem like ordinary misfortune. A missed payment here, a fee there, a sale that does not quite add up. No single incident is large enough to warrant investigation. But taken together, over 3 years it is not misfortune, it is architecture." When they returned to the house, Margot spread her Fraudulent's papers on the library table beside Colton's own ledgers, and beside them she placed Fenn's document. She did not explain at length. She pointed. She showed him the dates, the names, the pattern. And now with Fenn's paper, alongside her father's notes and the Alderton entry from the morning, what she was showing him was not a suspicion. It was a structure. 3 men operating across multiple points of the estate, each theft reinforcing the others. Each designed to make the estate appear to be failing under Colton's management, while the actual wealth flowed quietly elsewhere. Colton studied the papers, his jaw tightened steadily as he read. She watched the controlled anger move through him. Not explosive, not theatrical. Deep and quiet and cold, the way a fault line shifts under sustained pressure before the surface shows any sign at all. "Your father found this," he said, "and they ruined him to bury it." "Yes," Margot said. Crayle inflated the debt deliberately. Then he came to collect it himself. The purpose of the debt was never the money. It was the removal of a witness. Colton looked at her across the table. The afternoon light from the library windows fell across the papers between them, illuminating the careful handwriting of a man who had done his job honestly and been systematically destroyed for it. "Then we should work together," he said. It was the first time he had said we since they had married. Margot looked at him across the spread of papers and found that the words settled something in her chest, some tight, suspended thing that had been braced since dawn in the old chapel. The next morning, Margot asked Colton to take her to the county registry office. He did not ask why until they were already in the carriage. "I want to see where the Eastern leases went." After Crayle declared them delinquent, she said. "Not where the estate ledger says they went. Where the county says they went." Colton studied her for a moment, then he nodded. That was one of the things she had begun to understand about him. Once he believed a course of action had purpose, he did not waste time defending his pride against it. Margot gave him the dates of the Alderton and Mortlake transfers. Vale disappeared into the record room and returned carrying 3 heavy volumes. He placed them on the counter with the care of a man setting down sleeping children. The first transfer looked ordinary. The Mortlake holding had passed from the tenant lease register into a private holding account after a declared default. The second looked nearly identical, the same language, the same witness format, the same county filing fee. But Margot did not look first at the names. She looked at the dates. Both transfers had been recorded within 48 hours of Crayle issuing the final debt notices. "That is fast," she said. Vale glanced over his spectacles. "For a disputed tenant holding, very fast. Who received them?" Vale turned the book. "Graywick Agricultural Trust." Colton frowned. "I have never heard of it." Margot asked for every transfer into Graywick during the previous 7 years. Vale gave her a look that suggested the request would ruin his morning. Then he went back into the record room. He returned with another book. There were 11 entries, not all from Breck Hollow. Some came from smaller holdings in the same county, but 5 were parcels Margot recognized from the estate maps. Everyone had followed the same sequence. A tenant fell behind according to paperwork administered by Crayle. A fee multiplied. A lease was terminated. The land transferred to Graywick. Margot traced the registration marks with one finger. "Who owns Graywick?" Vale hesitated. That was enough to make Colton look at him differently. "It is a trust," Vale said. "Ownership is not listed here. The managing agent is. He turned to the formation page. Merritt Lowe. For a moment, no one spoke. Margot felt the structure become visible in a new way. Crayle created the debt. Merritt converted the debt into legal transfer. Jasper presented the loss of productive land as evidence that Colton could not manage the estate. Then the land quietly moved into a trust administered by Merritt himself. They were not merely stealing income from Breck Hollow. They were carving pieces off the estate and hiding them behind paper. I want certified copies, Margot said. Vale removed his spectacles. Mrs. Breck, certified copies of these entries become part of a formal request record. Anyone with cause to inspect the registry can see that you requested them. Meaning Merritt will know, Colton said. Meaning anyone watching these books will know, Vale replied. Margot considered that for perhaps 3 seconds. Make the copies. A voice behind them said, I would advise against that. She knew the voice before she turned. Denton Crayle stood in the doorway with his black leather case beneath one arm. He looked exactly as he had in the Sable cottage. Pressed coat, controlled expression. The same silver-handled cane. But here, away from her sick father and the leaking roof, the effect was different. He looked less like authority and more like a man who had grown accustomed to being mistaken for it. Mr. Crayle, Margot said. Mrs. Breck, I confess the title still surprises me. That sounds like a private difficulty. Vale looked down at the ledger with the concentrated neutrality of a man who wished very much to become furniture. Crayle stepped closer. These records are complicated. Old leases often pass through temporary holding entities during restructuring. A woman unfamiliar with estate administration could easily misunderstand what she is seeing. Margot looked at the 11 transfers, then explained them. His expression barely changed. Explain why 5 Breck Hollow tenant properties moved into a trust administered by Merritt Lowe within days of debt notices issued by you. Explain why the estate books record the holdings as losses, while the county register shows them preserved inside a private trust. Explain why my father wrote your name beside the same transactions before he was dismissed. Crayle's eyes sharpened at the mention of her father. There it was, small but visible. He lowered his voice. Your father was given every opportunity to walk away from matters beyond his position. He chose not to. Margot became very still. Was that what you told him before you destroyed his name? Crayle glanced at Colton and then back to her. I am telling you that men who spend their lives around estates learn something women raised outside them often do not. Property survives because unpleasant decisions are made quietly. Your father mistook the machinery of preservation for corruption. And you mistook silence for permission, Margot said. The room went quiet. Crayle's polite surface thinned. You should be careful, Mrs. Breck. Your father is still ill. His circumstances remain delicate. The cottage he occupies sits on rights that can become complicated very quickly. Colton moved before Margot did. One step, nothing more. But the entire quality of the room changed. Do not threaten her father, he said. Crayle raised one hand. I threaten no one. Margot looked at Vale. Make 2 certified etists. Crayle's eyes returned to her. 3, she said. 1 for the estate, 1 for Judge Keene, 1 for my father. Vale reached for the copying paper. Crayle stood there for another moment. Then he smiled again, but the smile had become worse. You have been at Breck Hollow less than a month, he said. You may discover that old houses do not surrender their secrets simply because a determined woman opens a ledger. Margot met his gaze. No, she said. Sometimes the secrets walk into the registry office and speak for themselves. Crayle left without another word. On the carriage ride home, Colton held the certified Greywick records on his knee. He threatened Harlan because you found the trust, he said. Yes, which means the trust matters. Yes. Colton looked through the carriage window toward the wet fields passing outside. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. I spent a year believing the estate was slipping because I was failing my father. Every lost lease felt like proof. Margot looked at him. That belief was useful to them. So they fed it. He turned back to her. You see that very quickly. I have had practice recognizing what happens when someone else's lie becomes your opinion of yourself. 3 days later, Margot drove with Colton to the Partlow, holding on the eastern edge of the estate. Della Partlow was a widow who had received a notice of debt and a demand to vacate her cottage within 30 days. The notice bore Crayle's seal and Margot recognized the structure of it the moment she unfolded it at Della's kitchen table. The same language, the same method, the same false accumulation of fees that became impossible debt. Identical in pattern to the notices in her father's papers. Della's hands were steady as she laid out her records. 30 years of rent payments, everyone documented, every receipt kept in a tin box on the shelf above her stove. There was no debt. The debt was an invention, constructed on paper with the specific intention of removing a family from land they had held for a generation. On the drive back, the rain began in earnest. By the time they passed the gatehouse, it was hammering against the carriage roof. The driver slowed, then stopped near a disused estate chapel barely visible through the trees, the fastest shelter available. They went inside. It was old and cold and smelled of stone and candle wax and the quiet that accumulates in spaces where people once prayed and no longer do. The high windows admitted a dim gray light. Margot stood with her back to one of the old pews and let her coat dry, and Colton stood near the door, with water still running from the brim of his hat. "This estate has been used against you," Margot said, looking at the rain through the window. "Yes," he said, "by people you trusted. Jasper was my father's brother." He said it without excuse, just the plain weight of the thing. "Merritt grew up here. He knows this house better than most of my servants." He removed his hat and turned it slowly in his hands. "I thought I was managing alone because I was capable of it. I understand now that I was managing alone because they ensured everyone who might have helped was removed. Including my father," Margot said quietly. "Including your father?" He paused. "I owe him more than I can easily express." The rain on the chapel roof was steady and loud. Margot looked at him in the dim gray light, stripped of the formal setting of the dining room and the Manor's imposing scale. He looked tired, not defeated. She did not think Colton Breck was capable of defeated, but worn in the way that sustained isolation wears a person down to something thinner and more honest than they intend to show. "When did your father die?" she asked. 14 months ago." A pause. "He was the only person I trusted entirely, and after him, no one. I know what that is," she said. He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted open slightly. "Your mother," he said, 3 years ago, which is also when my father's difficulties began." She looked at the old chapel window. "We each lost the person who made the rest of the world make sense." He was quiet. "Then, yes, that is exactly what it is." The rain eased slightly. Neither of them moved. He said, carefully, as though testing the weight of each word before releasing it, "I did not marry you for love, Margot." She had not expected him to use her given name. The difference was significant. "I know," she said. "But I find," he said, "that every day I spend in this house with you, I have another reason to wish I had." The words fell into the stillness of the chapel and the sound of the rain, and stayed there, hanging in the cold air between them, neither claimed nor released. She did not answer, but she did not step away. After a long moment, the rain slowed enough that the horses could move, and they returned to Breck Hollow in a silence that was warmer and less resolved than any silence between them before, full of the ache of something that had been named but not yet claimed. That evening, a dinner was held at a neighboring estate. Lenora Voss had arranged it. The guest list was carefully chosen. Local magistrates, estate investors with connections to Breck Hollow's income, county families whose opinions shaped local feeling. The stated purpose was an autumn social gathering. The real purpose was visible to anyone paying attention. Margot sat at the table in a borrowed gown, deep green silk altered by Opal Greer's hand to fit her. She was aware of every eye in the room. When the soup was removed, Lenora drew the conversation toward estate management, with the expertise of someone who had rehearsed the performance. She complimented Colton generously, the sort of compliment that contains, in its warmth, the implication that the recipient needed complimenting. Then she looked at Margot. "It must be quite overwhelming," she said pleasantly. "Managing a household of this scale, when one's experience has been so, how shall I say, modest." Margot set her wine glass down. "I find it illuminating," she said. She looked directly at the magistrate nearest her, a man named Judge Aldous Keene, who had been watching her carefully since she sat down. "Judge Keene, you are familiar with the Mortlake tenant holdings on the eastern boundary of Breck Hollow." I believe your family holds leases adjacent to them. Keene looked mildly surprised. I am, yes. Are you aware that the Mortlake holding changed hands in the register 18 months ago? It is currently recorded as transferred to a private holding entity rather than renewed with the family that worked it for 20 years. Margot paused, letting the table absorb the weight of the question. I understand the Mortlake family came to you last month for assistance after losing their holding. The room shifted. This was not a woman reciting figures from a ledger. This was a woman who had walked the land, talked to the people on it, and connected what she found to a man sitting 3 chairs away who had the authority to confirm it. The Mortlake family, the judge said slowly, is the family my steward mentioned.
Yes.
They applied to me for help. I believe they would have, Margot said simply. The dinner ended shortly after. In the carriage on the way back, Colton sat across from her in the dark. You are extraordinary, he said. I am practical, she said. Those are not mutually exclusive. The following morning, the first blow landed. Margot came down to find the estate office door standing open and the room in disarray. 2 ledgers were missing from the shelves: the tenant accounts for the Eastern Holdings and the land transfer records. Fenwick Greer met her in the corridor with the controlled expression of a man delivering news he has already assessed and found serious. Someone entered through the cellar passage on the west side last night, he said. The passage is normally locked. Only the family and hold keys open it. Margot understood immediately. Someone inside the house had opened that door for someone outside it. She looked at Fenwick and saw that he understood this too, and that the understanding sat heavily on him, because it meant the threat was not only outside the gates, it was inside the walls. When Colton learned what had happened, something shifted in him that Margot had not seen before. He did not raise his voice. He did not pace or strike the table. He went still in a way that was more alarming than anger, the absolute contained stillness of a man who has absorbed a blow and is deciding precisely where to direct the force of his response. His eyes went flat and cold, and for the first time she saw clearly the iron that ran beneath his composure. Margot watched him for a moment. Then she said, "The ledgers they took are not the only copies." He looked at her. "I made copies of every critical document during my second week here," she said. 3 complete sets. 1 is in the Bible in my bag. 2 are with Mrs. Greer, hidden separately in the East Wing. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence. He stared at her. "You expected this," he said. "I expected something," she said. "I did not know what form it would take. But I learned from poverty that the safest thing to do with important evidence is to ensure it cannot all be taken at once." "When did you make the copies?" "The second week." He looked at her across the room, and there was something in his expression that went beyond surprise or gratitude. It was the look of a man encountering something that keeps exceeding the limits he has set for it. "You have been preparing for this since the second week," he said. "I have been preparing for this since the night Crayle came to my father's door," Margot said. "I only changed the subject of the preparation." Within 2 days, Margot and Opal identified the source of the breach. A young housemaid named Nettie Groves had opened the cellar passage. Margot did not go to Colton with this information first. She went to Opal Greer and asked her to arrange a private conversation in the kitchen pantry, away from the rest of the staff, at a time when the household would be occupied with afternoon duties. Nettie was 19 years old. She had worked at Breck Hollow for 2 years. Her mother held a small leasehold on the southern edge of the estate, a 1/4 acre of kitchen garden, and a cottage that had been in the family long enough to feel permanent. When Margot closed the pantry door and told Nettie quietly that she knew about the cellar passage, the girl's composure broke almost as immediately. She was not a practiced deceiver. She was a frightened young woman who had been caught between forces larger than herself. "Merritt Lowe," Nettie said. "He came to me a month ago. He said if I did not help him, he would have my mother removed from her leasehold. She has nowhere else to go. He said all I had to do was leave one door unlocked." She was shaking. "I am sorry, ma'am. I did not know what else to do." Margot studied her for a long moment. The girl's fear was genuine. Her hands were trembling against the fabric of her apron. The threat Merritt had used was the same mechanism applied to the tenants, The same lever pulled again and again, the weaponization of ordinary people's dependence on the land they worked. Margot recognized it because it was the same lever that had been pulled on her own family. Crayle had used debt. Merritt used leases. The instrument was different. The cruelty was identical. "You have two choices," Margot said. "You can leave Breck Hollow today and find your own way. Or you can stay. And you can tell me exactly what Merritt Lowe has asked you to do, and everything he has told you. And you can continue in this house under my protection. But if you stay, you report to me, not to him. Do you understand?" Nettie looked at her with the stunned expression of someone who has been offered mercy when they expected punishment. "Yes, ma'am," she said. "I understand." "Then sit down," Margot said, "and tell me everything. From the beginning." What Nettie told her over the next hour filled in gaps that the ledgers alone could not. Merritt had visited the estate 3 times in the weeks before Margot's arrival, always meeting Crayle at the gatehouse rather than the main house. He had given Nettie specific instructions about which doors to leave accessible and which rooms to report on. He had asked her, in particular, whether the new Mrs. Breck spent time in the estate office and what documents she appeared to be reading. The information was flowing in both directions. Margot's investigation was being observed by the very people she was investigating, and the only reason they had not yet moved against her more aggressively was that they believed their surveillance was undetected. From that moment, Margot had a window into Merritt Lowe's operations that he did not know existed. And more importantly, she understood the precise timeline of his preparations. He was not simply filing legal papers. He was building a live intelligence operation inside Breck Hollow, and he believed he was winning. 3 days later, an old man came to the estate office door. Silas Thorne was 70 years old, the longest-serving tenant on Breck Hollow land, and he had the weathered dignity of a man who had spent his entire life doing honest work on soil that belonged to someone else. He carried a leather satchel that he set on Margot's desk with the care of a man handling something irreplaceable. Inside was a bundle of records going back 15 years. Every lease agreement, every payment receipt, every correspondence with the estate. And beneath them, wrapped in oilcloth, was a ledger. Not a copy of the estate's official books. A separate ledger entirely. Written in a hand Margot did not recognize, but that Silas identified immediately. "Orland Breck wrote that," Silas said. "The old Mr. Breck. He kept it privately, separate from the official accounts. He gave it to me before he died, along with a letter." He produced the letter. It was brief, written in a careful, deliberate hand. "If there comes a day when someone asks about the eastern lands, show them this ledger. Do not give it to my son unless he has found someone he trusts to help him carry it. I was not able to protect him from what is coming. Perhaps this will." Silas looked at Margot. His eyes were clear and certain. "You are the one he was waiting for," he said. "I have watched you since you arrived. You are the person Mr. Breck hoped his son would find." Margot opened the ledger. What she found inside stopped her breathing for a full 3 seconds. Orland Breck had maintained a complete parallel accounting of every transaction on the estate for the final 4 years of his life. Every payment recorded in the official books was listed alongside the actual payment made. Every fee charged to a tenant was compared against the fee that should have been charged. Every land transfer was documented with the real terms beside the falsified ones. It was not a collection of notes or suspicions. It was a systematic, meticulous record of theft, compiled by a man who understood exactly what was being done to his estate and had not been able to stop it alone. The official books showed a healthy estate experiencing natural decline. Orland's ledger showed a healthy estate being deliberately bled by 3 men who had positioned themselves to inherit the corpse. Margot looked at Silas across the desk. "How long have you been carrying this?" she asked. "Since the old Mr. Breck gave it to me. 3 years and some months." Silas pressed his lips together. He knew what was happening to his own house, Mrs. Breck. He knew, and he could not stop it. His brother had too many friends in the county. His cousin had built the legal framework to make everything look proper. And your father, the one man inside the system who was honest enough to notice, had already been removed. Orland was alone with the truth. So he wrote it down, and he gave it to the one person they would never think to search. A tenant farmer, Margot said. The oldest one, Silas said. The one they considered least important. He paused. That was always their mistake, Mrs. Breck. They never paid attention to the people who worked the land. They thought we were furniture. Margot closed the ledger and pressed both hands flat against its cover and sat very still for a long time. She was holding in her hands the work of a dead man who had seen everything, recorded everything, and trusted it to the patience of someone who would wait. The weight of that trust was considerable. The responsibility it placed on her was exact. That same week, Jasper Breck came to Breck Hollow, while Colton was at the far end of the estate inspecting the drainage works. He arrived unannounced and, Fenwick Greer showed him to the morning room with the professional courtesy that protocol demanded and personal feeling did not. Margot received him alone. Jasper Breck was a man who carried charm the way other men carried weapons, always accessible, always deployed with precision, always concealing something harder underneath. He was handsome in a slightly overpolished way. His clothing was too carefully assembled, his manners too smooth. He greeted Margot with elaborate courtesy and eyes that measured her from head to hem and found everything wanting. Mrs. Breck, he said warmly, I hope you will forgive the intrusion. I came only out of concern. Concern for what? Margot said. For my nephew. Jasper settled into the chair across from her with the ease of a man who considered every room in this house partly his own. He crossed one leg over the other and regarded her with an expression of careful, sympathetic worry. You are new here, Mrs. Breck. You see Colton as he presents himself. Strong, capable, in control. But I have known him his entire life, and I have watched his father before him, and I must tell you something that troubles me deeply. He leaned forward slightly. Orland Breck, in his final years, suffered episodes of severe withdrawal. He would disappear into this house for weeks at a time, refusing visitors, refusing counsel, refusing to acknowledge that the estate required attention. It was a pattern, a family pattern, and I see the same thing happening with Colton. The isolation, the distrust of those closest to him, the sudden impulsive decisions. He paused, letting the word impulsive hang in the air between them with unmistakable reference. You are an outsider, Mrs. Breck. You can see things we cannot. I ask you, honestly, as someone who cares about this family, is he well? Is he truly well? Margot listened to every word. She kept her hands still in her lap and her expression neutral, and she let Jasper Breck talk, because a man who believes he is succeeding will always reveal more than a man who believes he is being watched. She understood exactly what he was doing. He was not asking for her honest assessment. He was planting a seed. If she repeated this conversation to Colton, it would create friction between them. The suspicion that even his own uncle questioned his stability. And if she did not repeat it, Jasper would use the same argument at the hearing, claiming that even those closest to Colton had observed his decline. Either way, he gained ground. But Margot had learned something about information during 3 years of poverty. The most valuable thing you can do with a dangerous piece of knowledge is not to react to it. It is to hold it quietly and let it show you the shape of your enemy's strategy. You raise a fair concern, she said. I will think on it carefully. Jasper smiled. It was the smile of a man who believed he had accomplished what he came to accomplish. He had, but not in the way he imagined. The acceleration came 5 days later. Jasper filed for the estate hearing not in 6 weeks, but in 3, citing urgent concerns about tenant welfare and estate mismanagement. Merritt Lowe submitted a formal legal petition to freeze Breck Hollow's operating accounts pending the hearing's outcome. If the accounts were frozen, Colton could not pay his workers, could not purchase feed or seed or supplies, could not maintain the daily operations that kept 60 families fed and sheltered. The estate would grind to a halt, and when the hearing convened, Breck Hollow would look exactly as Jasper described it, a property failing under an incompetent master. Margot composed a letter to Judge Keene that same afternoon. She did not cite emotion or loyalty. She cited the specific tenant payment records she had compiled. The documented discrepancies between Crayle's filed notices and the family's own receipts, and the fact that the tenant harm Jasper cited as grounds for an emergency hearing was caused not by Colton's management, but by Crayle's fraudulent collection practices. which Jasper himself had authorized. She requested that the account freeze be denied on the grounds that granting it would compound the very harm the petition claimed to address. Judge Keene denied the freeze, but he kept the accelerated hearing date. 3 weeks. Margot had 3 weeks to assemble 3 years of evidence into a case that would hold before a panel of magistrates in Colton Breck's own great hall, with his enemies sitting across from her and every tenant family on the estate watching from the gallery. The accelerated hearing created a second problem almost immediately. Jasper could not freeze the estate accounts through Judge Keene, so he attacked confidence instead. 2 mornings after the judge denied the petition, the estate grain merchant refused Breck Hollow's order for winter feed. Fenwick brought the letter to the breakfast room. The supplier, Calder and Pike, had done business with the Brecks for 21 years. The letter was brief and apologetic. Because the legal status of the estate was under formal dispute, all further deliveries would require cash in advance until the hearing was resolved. Colton read it once. "How much feed is due before the hearing?" Margot asked. "Enough for the stable horses and tenant teams through the first hard frost," he said. "We have reserves, but not enough to make every supplier demand cash at once." That was the point. Within the hour, 2 more letters arrived. A timber hauler wanted immediate settlement. The mill mechanic who maintained the creek machinery would not begin scheduled repairs without payment in full. No court had frozen Breck Hollow's money, but rumor had done nearly the same work. Colton pushed back from the table. "I will ride to town and settle the accounts personally." "With what?" Margot asked. "A state reserve. And if Jasper frightens 6 more suppliers tomorrow." His jaw tightened. "Then we pay 6 more. Until the reserve is empty 3 days before the hearing, and Jasper stands in the great hall describing an estate without operating cash." Colton stared at her. He knew she was right. He disliked it anyway. "What do you suggest?" "We do not pay for confidence," she said. "We restore it." They rode to Calder and Pike before noon. "This is not personal," Pike said before either of them had sat down. "I have 12 employees and creditors of my own." Jasper Breck's solicitor sent notice that control of the estate may change within 3 weeks. "If I deliver on 30-day terms and the new council refuses the account, I carry the loss." "Merritt sent you notice," Margot said. Pike hesitated. His office became very quiet. "I did not say that. You did not need to." Colton's expression hardened, but Margot touched 2 fingers lightly to the edge of the desk. Not to restrain him, to remind him that anger would make Pike defensive when what they needed was truth. Margot opened the folder she had brought from the estate office. "Mr. Pike, when was the last time Breck Hollow failed to pay Calder and Pike?" "Never." "In how many years?" 21. She placed payment records on the desk. 21 years of accounts. The last 7 under the same period Jasper now called mismanagement. Every supplier invoice paid. Every ordinary operating obligation met. The theft had harmed tenants and drained the estate, but the estate itself was still productive enough to honor its real debts. Then she placed Judge Keene's written denial of the account freeze beside them. "There is no legal restriction on Breck Hollow's accounts," she said. "There is only a letter from a man asking you to behave as though one exists." Pike rubbed one hand over his beard. "He says the hearing could remove Mr. Breck." "It could," Margot said. "And if it does, your contract remains an estate obligation. But I am willing to give you something stronger than my opinion." She took out a new document. Colton looked at her. He had not seen it before. It was a short guarantee drafted that morning, with Judge Keene's clerk. Any goods delivered under existing Breck Hollow contracts before the hearing would be recognized as necessary operating expenses and presented as protected obligations regardless of the hearing's outcome. It did not eliminate Pike's risk completely. Nothing honest could. But it made the legal position clear enough that rumor could no longer do all the work. Pike read it twice. "You arranged this morning?" "Yes. Before coming here." "Yes. Why? Because if I arrived asking you to trust us, you would hear desperation. I wanted to arrive with something you could trust without liking us." For the first time, Pike smiled. "That sounds like Harlan Sable." Margot's head lifted. "You knew my father, knew of him. He checked several estate contracts years ago. Annoyed everybody because he read every line." Pike looked down at the guarantee again. "Honest man." The words landed more deeply than Margot expected. Pike signed the delivery authorization. Before they left, he pulled another paper from the drawer. "Since we are deciding to be honest today," he said, "you should see this." It was the letter that had frightened him, not merely a general warning. It carried Merritt Lowe's signature and stated that suppliers extending further credit to Breck Hollow might find their claims reviewed or rejected by a future management council. A threat disguised as advice. Margot asked for a copy. Pike gave her the original. "You may need it more than I do." By evening, the grain order had been restored. The mill mechanic returned to his scheduled work after Pike telegraphed two other suppliers that Judge Keene had denied the freeze. The timber hauler withdrew his cash demand before Margot had even reached home. Jasper's attempt to make Breck Hollow look financially unstable had produced the opposite result. It had given Margot written evidence that Merritt was deliberately trying to disrupt estate operations before the hearing. Colton found her in the estate office after dinner, adding the letter to the evidence file. "You did not tell me about the guarantee," he said. "I did not know if Judge Keene's clerk would agree to prepare it until he did. You solved the problem before I had finished being angry at it. That is not always a virtue. Today it was." He stood across the desk from her for a moment. Then he said, "I nearly emptied the reserve because I wanted to prove I could pay." Margot closed the file. That is what Jasper expected. Pride is expensive when another man chooses the price. Colton gave a short breath that was almost a laugh. "You are very hard on pride. I cannot afford much of it." His expression softened. "No," he said. "You simply spend yours more carefully." The moment was small, but something changed in it. Until then, Margot had been helping Colton defend his estate. After that day, he began asking her what she thought before he made decisions that carried risk. Not because she was his wife by contract, because he trusted her judgment. And Jasper, without intending to, had strengthened the very partnership he was trying to prove did not exist. She spent those weeks in the estate office with a discipline that Opal Greer later said reminded her of Orland Breck himself. Every document was organized chronologically and cross-referenced against both the official ledgers and Orland's parallel accounting. Every tenant family affected was visited personally. Margot drove the estate carriage to the Eastern Holdings 3 times in the first week, sitting at kitchen tables with families who had been defrauded and documenting their accounts with the same careful precision her father had used. She compiled a master timeline showing how each theft connected to the others, how each false debt notice preceded a land transfer, how each land transfer enriched accounts that Crayle administered and Jasper oversaw. Bennett Greer proved invaluable during this period. He had served the Breck family for 23 years, and his memory for household details was extraordinary. He recalled specific dates when correspondence had arrived bearing Colton's name, but written in a hand that was not Colton's. He recalled payments that had been redirected from household staff accounts into external ledgers. He had kept copies of certain documents that his professional instincts told him might one day matter. When Margot asked him why he had never brought this information forward, he said simply, "I had no one to bring it to." Mr. Breck was grieving, and the people doing the harm were the people with the authority. Through Nettie, Margot learned that Merritt was preparing a final surprise for the hearing. He had visited 2 tenant families on the western side of the estate, families Margot had not yet reached in her investigation, and he had obtained signed statements from them. Nettie did not know the content of the statements, but she knew that Merritt had described them to Crayle as the final piece. Margot filed this information and continued her preparation. She could not prevent what she did not fully know, but she could ensure that whatever Merritt produced, the weight of evidence on the other side would be overwhelming. A letter arrived from the valley the following week. The physician Colton had sent was installed at the Sable cottage. Her father was receiving proper care. He was weak but stable. He sent his love in the careful, restrained way of a man who believes strong feeling should be expressed quietly, through the precision of his handwriting and the steadiness of the hand that held the pen. Margot held the letter standing in the entrance hall with the morning light coming through the tall windows, and she let herself feel the relief, just for a moment. Just the private, quiet relief of knowing he was safe. Then she folded the letter and put it away and went back to work. The night before the hearing, Margot went down to the library. The candles were already lit. Colton was there, standing at the window with a glass in his hand, and the stillness of a man who has stopped pretending to work and is simply existing in the difficulty of the night. He turned when she came in and did not look surprised to see her. She sat at the table. He sat across from her. "Are you afraid?" she asked. "No," he said. "I am angry." A pause. "I've been angry for 14 months. Tonight it is simply clearer." "Good," she said. "Good. Anger is more useful than fear," she said. "I have learned that." He was quiet for a moment. Then, his voice lower than before, stripped of formality, carrying the weight of something he had been holding back for weeks, he said, "Margot, whatever happens tomorrow, having you in this house, having you beside me, it has changed things. It has changed me." She held his gaze. She felt the warmth of those words settle somewhere behind her ribs, not the warmth of victory or of being needed. Something softer and more complicated. The warmth of being known by someone who had taken the trouble to look and had not looked away. "Then let us make sure there is a Breck Hollow left to change in," she said. She had prepared 3 complete sets of documentation, stored in 3 separate locations. She had Orland Breck's parallel ledger written in his own hand. She had Nettie Groves's account of Merritt Lowe's methods. She had Della Partlow's 30 years of receipts. She had Wyatt Fenn's fabricated grazing fee and the record of horses sold for a debt that never existed. She had Silas Thorne's testimony and the letter from a dead man to the son he could not protect. She had Fenwick Greer's copies of forged correspondence. She had her father's papers, the careful observations of a quiet clerk who had done his job honestly and been destroyed for it. And she had the one thing none of them had expected her to have, which was the knowledge gained from a conversation Jasper Breck believed had gone exactly as he planned, that tomorrow he would argue not only mismanagement, but mental instability, the same pattern he claimed had afflicted Orland Breck, now supposedly repeating in the Sun. Colton looked at her across the library table, and the expression on his face was one she had not seen from him before. It was not the careful composure he wore in public, or the measured authority he used with the tenants. It was the unguarded look of a man who has spent 14 months believing himself alone and has discovered, in the most improbable of circumstances, that he is not. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said again, more quietly this time, "I want you to know that even if we lose, what you have done in this house is the most important thing that has happened here since my father died." "We are not going to lose," Margot said. She knew what was coming, and she was ready. The morning of the hearing was cold and clear, the kind of October morning that arrives with a pale authority, as though the sky itself has decided to pay attention. Margot dressed carefully in a dark blue gown that Opal Greer had altered to fit her properly, and she stood before the mirror in her room and looked at the woman looking back at her. 25 years old, 3 years of poverty behind her, 3 weeks of preparation behind that, and ahead of her a room full of men who had spent years building a machine designed to take everything from the man she had married, and who now intended to use her as evidence of his poor judgment. She picked up her father's Bible from the bed. Inside it, pressed flat between the pages, were the documents she had carried from the Sable cottage on a gray morning that felt like it belonged to another life. She held the Bible for a moment, feeling its familiar weight, and then she tucked it under her arm and went downstairs. The great hall had been prepared. It was a room designed for exactly this kind of formal gathering, long and high-ceilinged, with the estate's portrait gallery looking down from the walls, and the Breck family crest carved in stone above the fireplace at the far end. 2 rows of chairs had been arranged for attendees, and behind a long oak table sat 3 magistrates assigned to the hearing, Judge Aldous Keene among them. Jasper Breck arrived with Merritt Lowe and Denton Crayle at his back, composed and perfectly dressed. He greeted the magistrates with warm ease, the performance of a man who has done this before and found it efficient. Lenora Voss attended as a witness. She sat near the back in a burgundy dress and did not look at Margot. The hall filled. Tenants, several of them. Margot recognized Della Partlow in the second row, sitting very straight with her hands folded in her lap. Silas Thorne was near the aisle, his leather satchel on the floor beside his chair. A handful of county figures, estate investors, household staff along the walls. Fenwick Greer stood at the side door with his hands behind his back and the composed alertness of a man who had made certain arrangements of his own. Margot sat beside Colton at the respondents' table. She placed her hands in her lap and kept them still. She was aware of the whispers as people found their seats. Cottage girl, farmer's wife, poor little thing. She kept her chin level and let them talk. Jasper opened with 30 minutes of elegant, measured character assassination. He cited Colton's withdrawal from society after his father's death. He cited the estate's unresolved tenant complaints. He cited the discrepancies in the accounts, presenting them naturally as evidence of neglect rather than fraud. He cited Colton's sudden unannounced marriage to a woman of no family and considerable financial desperation. Then Jasper shifted direction. His voice softened. He spoke of his brother Orland with what appeared to be genuine sorrow. He described episodes of withdrawal, periods where Orland had refused visitors and neglected his duties. A family tendency, Jasper called it, an inherited fragility. He looked at the magistrates with the steady earnestness of a man who wished he did not have to say what he was about to say. "I see the same pattern in my nephew," Jasper said. "The isolation, the erratic decisions, the refusal to accept counsel from those who know this estate and this family, and most recently, the impulsive attachment to a young woman whose primary qualification appears to be the desperation of her circumstances." He paused. "I do not say this with malice. I say it with grief. But this hearing must consider whether Colton Breck is capable of managing the legacy his father left him, or whether that legacy requires protection from its current steward." Margot did not react. She had known this was coming since the morning Jasper sat across from her in the parlor and tested the waters with his careful, concerned questions about Colton's well-being. She had let him believe the seed had taken root. She had let him build his argument around it. And now she knew exactly where his case was weakest. Because a man who builds a case on a lie always leaves the lie's foundations exposed to anyone who knows where to look. Merritt Lowe presented his legal documents next. Neat, precise, carefully assembled. They told the story of a mismanaged estate, a passive and disconnected master, and the urgent necessity of a management council for the protection of Breck Hollow's tenants and investors. Crayle was called as a witness. He spoke with the smooth expertise of a man who has lied inside legal frameworks for a long time and learned exactly how far the boundaries of sworn honesty can be pushed. He said Margot Sable had been dismissed from his clerk position for dishonest accounting. He said it calmly as though it were a matter of established record rather than an act of deliberate destruction. Then Merritt Lowe produced his final piece of evidence. 2 signed statements from tenant families on the western side of the estate, claiming that since Margot's arrival, they had been pressured to sign documents they did not understand, and that the new Mrs. Breck had involved herself in financial matters beyond her competence, causing confusion and distress among the families she claimed to be helping. Margot felt the blow land. She had not anticipated this specific angle. For a moment, the room tilted the way rooms tilt when a weapon you did not see coming finds its mark. Merritt had used the same mechanism he had used on Nettie Groves, threatening families with the loss of their land to extract statements that served his purpose. He had turned her work with the tenants into evidence against her. She looked at the 2 names on the statements. She did not recognize the families, but she recognized the method. The same lever, the same threat, the same exploitation of people who depended on the land beneath their feet and could be made to say anything to keep it. The magistrates looked at the statements. They looked at Margot. The room waited. Margot stood. She did not raise her voice. She addressed the magistrates directly. "Your Honors," she said, "I would like to present documents I believe are material to this hearing." She began with a pattern. She presented it in chronological order. She did not editorialize. She laid each document on the table and let it speak. The Alderton lease transfer and the false debt notice that preceded it, the Partlow notice and the documented payment records that contradicted it, the Mortlake holding and the account entry that recorded a missed payment that the family's own records showed paid on time. The household accounts showing payments recorded as made to staff that the staff confirmed never receiving. The correspondence in her father's papers showing the three names, Crayle, Jasper Breck, and Lowe, appearing beside anomalies going back 7 years. And the originals of her father's discovery notes, the careful, precise observations of a quiet man who had done his job and been systematically destroyed for it. Mr. Crayle stated that my father was dismissed for dishonest accounting, Margot said. My father's notes document, with dates and figures, the accounting irregularities he found and reported. He was dismissed shortly after making that report. The question this hearing might consider is who benefits from the removal of the person who found the evidence. She paused. Then she placed one final document on the table. A ledger, not a copy of the estate's official books. A separate ledger entirely, written in a hand that 3 people in this room recognized immediately. This was written by Colton Breck, Margot said. It is a parallel accounting of every significant transaction on this estate for the final 4 years of his life. Every payment recorded in the official books is listed alongside the actual payment made. Every fee charged to a tenant is compared against the fee that should have been charged. Mr. Jasper Breck has described his brother as a man who suffered episodes of withdrawal and mental fragility. This ledger suggests a different explanation. Colton Breck was not withdrawing from his responsibilities. He was documenting meticulously and in secret the systematic theft of his estate by the very people who now claim to be protecting it. The room changed. You could feel it change. The weight of the air, the quality of the silence, the particular shift in the way people sit when they realize the story they have been told is not the true story. Margot turned to the matter of the Western tenant statements. She said, Mr. Lowe has presented signed statements from 2 families, alleging that I pressured them. I would like to call a witness who can speak to Mr. Lowe's methods of obtaining cooperation from the people on this estate. Nettie Groves stepped forward from the line of household staff along the wall. Her face was pale, but her voice was clear. She told the magistrates how Merritt Lowe had come to her a month before the hearing and threatened to have her mother removed from her leasehold if she did not cooperate. She described unlocking the cellar passage so that someone could enter the estate office at night and remove ledgers. And she described Merritt explaining to her, in specific terms, the method he used to secure cooperation from tenants, the same threat applied to different families, the same lever pulled again and again. He told me, Nettie said, that if they did not sign what he needed them to sign, their leases would be reviewed. He said it was standard estate business, but I saw the letters he gave me to deliver, and they were not standard. They were threats. Della Partlow rose from the second row. Her voice shook slightly, but it was clear. The notice I received was not for a debt I owe, she said. I have paid my rent every month for 30 years. I have the receipts. Everyone. The magistrates looked at Crayle. Crayle said nothing. His face had gone the color of old paper. Fenwick Greer stepped forward from the wall. He spoke in the measured voice of a man who has been waiting for a long time to say something important in a room that would hear it. He confirmed that certain correspondence bearing Colton Breck's name had been signed not by Colton, but by Merritt Lowe, on 3 specific occasions. He produced the copies he had kept. He confirmed forged household instructions that had redirected payments away from staff who had earned them and into accounts administered by Crayle. Silas Thorne rose from his seat near the aisle. He confirmed that Colton Breck had given him the parallel ledger before his death, along with the letter, instructing him to hold it until someone trustworthy came to help carry it forward. He looked at Margot as he spoke, and the certainty in his expression was the kind that comes from waiting a very long time for something and finally seeing it arrive. Jasper Breck stood very still. The surface charm had cracked, and beneath it was something smaller and harder and considerably less attractive. Merritt Lowe was looking at the documents with the rapid calculation of a man measuring what could still be salvaged and finding the answer was very little. Lenora Voss was looking at no one. Crayle rose abruptly from his chair and moved toward the door. He was stopped by 2 men Fenwick Greer had quietly stationed there an hour before. Colton stood. He spoke for the first time. The room, which had been shifting and murmuring through the testimony, went still. His voice was steady and carried the weight of a man who has been silent long enough and is choosing his words with the care they deserve. He said that after his father's death, he had made the mistake of believing grief was something to be endured privately, and that silence was the same as strength. He said that he had watched the people closest to his family's legacy exploit that silence, and that he had been too proud or too broken to ask for help. He said that the marriage his uncle called impulsive was the first clear decision he had made in 14 months, and that he had made it because he recognized in Margot Sable something he had been missing in himself. Not weakness looking for rescue, strength looking for a partner. He said that he had brought Margot to Breck Hollow, believing he needed a wife to hold a position. What he had found instead was a partner, a woman who had looked at this estate's wounds and understood them before he had finished explaining them. A woman who had protected his tenants, uncovered his enemies, and stood in the hall of his family and told the truth without flinching. She is the mistress of Breck Hollow, he said, not as a title given to her, but as a truth she earned, room by room, ledger by ledger, family by family. And I will answer any question this hearing requires of me. But I will not stand here and allow the people who robbed my father's estate and destroyed an honest man's life to pretend they are the ones protecting it. He sat down. The room was quiet in the way. Rooms are quiet when something true has been said and the truth is still settling into the air. Margot kept her eyes forward. She felt the warmth of his arm beside hers at the table. She did not look at him. She did not need to. The magistrates conferred. Judge Keene asked several clarifying questions about the parallel ledger's chain of custody, and Silas answered each one with the careful patience of a man who has been waiting 3 years for someone to ask. The hearing ended before afternoon. Jasper Breck's authority over any Breck Hollow account was suspended pending a full investigation. Crayle was remanded to the custody of the county magistrate for examination. Merritt Lowe was ordered to produce the complete record of documents he had prepared and to make himself available for further questioning. The management council application was rejected. Breck Hollow remained Colton's. After the room emptied, Margot walked alone into the corridor off the great hall. The noise of departure echoed from the entrance, voices, movement, the systematic unraveling of a threat that had been building for 3 years. She stood in the corridor's quiet and let the trembling that had not been visible during the hearing finally move through her. She had been afraid. She had been afraid all morning, in the controlled and purposeful way that fear functions when there is a great deal depending on what you do with it. Colton found her there. He stood close enough that she could sense the warmth of him in the cool corridor air. "You saved me," he said. She had heard those words before, from her father, in a different form. They always made her feel the same complicated thing, proud and aching and not entirely comfortable with the weight of being someone's rescue. "I stood beside you," she said. "That is different." He was quiet for a moment. Then, very quietly, "That is the part I never knew how to ask for." She reached out and took his hand. She meant it simply. The plain gesture of one person reaching toward another in the moment after a sustained ordeal. But his fingers closed around hers with a careful, absolute certainty, and she felt the warmth of it travel up hers and settle somewhere near the center of her chest. They stood there for a moment. Just that. Then a servant appeared at the end of the corridor with a message. Colton Sable had collapsed. The word collapsed moved through Margot's body, the way a stone moves through still water, sinking fast and sending disruption outward in every direction. She had spent 3 weeks in a state of sustained composure, holding herself together with the precision of someone who understood that any crack would be exploited. And now, in the corridor of the house she had just saved, the composure did not crack so much as become irrelevant. She was not a strategist in that moment. She was a daughter, and her father was ill, and the distance between Breck Hollow and the valley felt like the distance between herself and the only person who had known her before any of this began. Colton did not ask questions. He did not offer options. He ordered the carriage immediately, told Fenwick to manage the household until their return, and was standing at the front door with his coat on before Margot had reached the foot of the stairs. It was the kind of decisive action that revealed something about a person that words never could. He understood urgency. He understood that in certain moments, the only appropriate response was movement. They drove through the dark countryside in silence. He sat across from her, and he did not offer her comfortable words because he understood by now that she did not want comfortable words. He simply stayed present. Once, on a rough stretch of road, the carriage lurched, and he reached across and steadied her arm and then withdrew his hand without comment. That was enough. The Sable cottage was warm when they arrived. The physician had been there all day. A fire was burning high, and the smell of medicine and clean linen was layered over the old familiar smell of cold smoke and worn wood. Margot went directly to her father's room. Harlan Sable was pale and slight against the pillows, but his eyes were open and clear when she came through the door, and the relief that moved across his face was the kind of expression that makes the whole of a difficult journey worth having made. She sat beside him and took his hand. "I heard," he said quietly. "The physician told me. It is done. It is done," she said. "Crayle is in custody. Jasper has been stripped of authority." The hearing went in Colton's favor. Harlan closed his eyes. His chest expanded with something that might have been the first full breath he had drawn in 3 years. "Your papers," Margot said. "They made the difference. Everything you wrote down, everything you kept. It was the evidence that held the case together." "I always meant them to," he said. "I was afraid of what would happen if I tried to act alone. I was afraid of what Crayle and his people would do." His hand tightened on hers. "I thought I had failed. I thought I had left you nothing but debt and trouble." "You left me everything I needed to fight," Margot said. "Exactly everything." Colton stood in the doorway. He did not come further into the room. He had the instinct, always, for the appropriate distance. But Harlan saw him, and the two men looked at each other across the small room, with its low ceiling and its careful, modest warmth, and something passed between them that did not require words. The acknowledgement of one man by another. The recognition of what had been protected and what had been earned. Harlan said, "Take care of her." Colton said, "She is taking rather good care of herself." Harlan's mouth moved in something close to a smile. It was the most his face had allowed in a very long time. They stayed in the valley for 2 days. Colton arranged for a permanent nurse, for improved medical care, for the cottage to be repaired and properly maintained. A better fireplace, new windows, the roof set right. He did these things quietly and practically, without theater. When Margot thanked him, he said there was nothing to thank him for. She looked at him, standing in the lane outside the cottage that had once been a portrait of failure, and was now, in the pale November light, simply a house being put right. And she knew, with a certainty that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with what had happened between two people who had spent weeks learning to trust each other in the middle of a war they had not started, that whatever she felt for this man had moved past the boundaries of any contract either of them had signed. When they returned to Breck Hollow, the estate was changed, not the building. The stone and the portraits and the formal gardens were exactly as they had been. But the atmosphere was different. The tension that had hung over it since her first morning had lifted. The servants moved with a different quality of ease. The household breathed. Word of the hearing had spread with the efficiency that news always travels through small communities. The county magistrate had opened a formal investigation. Crayle and Merritt were occupied with their own considerable difficulties. Lenora Voss had departed for a cousin's home with an elegance that concealed badly the speed of her retreat. Jasper had gone to his own property under circumstances that his solicitor was managing with decreasing optimism. The inefficient Marries produced one final confrontation before the estate could truly settle. 10 days after the hearing, Judge Keene asked Margot and Colton to come to the county courthouse. Jasper was there with his solicitor. So was Merritt Lowe, though without the confidence he had carried into the Great Hall. Crayle remained in custody while the magistrate examined the financial records seized from his office. The meeting was not another hearing. Judge Keene made that clear. It was an attempt to resolve immediate matters before the criminal and civil inquiries widened. Jasper's solicitor placed a proposal on the table. Jasper would surrender every claim to management authority at Breck Hollow. Greywick Agricultural Trust would return all Breck properties still under its control. Merritt would withdraw every disputed tenant filing. In exchange, Colton would agree not to pursue a separate civil claim against Jasper for damages to the estate beyond the restoration of property. The solicitor slid the paper toward Colton. "It is a practical end," he said. "Your estate is preserved. The land returns. Further litigation could take years and cost everyone involved a great deal." Colton did not touch the paper. Margot read it. There was something missing. "What happens to the tenants?" she asked. The solicitor looked at her. "The properties return to Breck Hollow." "That is not what I asked. What happens to the people who paid invented fees? The families whose horses were sold? The tenants forced off holdings they had worked for decades? The staff whose wages were redirected? Those issues can be examined separately." "Meaning later," Margot said. Jasper shifted in his chair. His polished calm had returned somewhat, but not enough. "Mrs. Breck, there must be a point at which sensible people stop trying to repair every unfortunate consequence of a complicated period." Margot looked at him. "Unfortunate consequence." Jasper exhaled. "We can spend years attaching moral language to every accounting decision, or we can restore the estate and allow everyone to move on." Colton's hand tightened once against the arm of his chair. Margot remained still. "My father lost his profession," she said. "Della Partlow nearly lost her home. Wyatt Fenn lost 4 horses. Nettie Groves was made to betray the household because you threatened her mother. Families left land they had worked most of their lives. Those were not consequences that appeared accidentally around an accounting decision. They were the method." Jasper's face hardened. "You have won, Mrs. Breck. Must you also enjoy humiliating everyone who opposed you?" There it was. The same mistake again. He believed accountability was humiliation because power had taught him never to distinguish the two. "I do not need you humiliated," Margot said. "I need the damage repaired." Judge Keene looked at her. "What would you consider necessary?" Margot had already prepared the answer. All Breck Hollow parcels held through Greywick returned immediately. Every false tenant debt canceled in writing. Every family removed through those debts, given first right to return to its former holding if the property remained available. Financial losses documented through Orland's ledger, and the seized Crayle accounts repaid from Greywick funds before any remainder was distributed to its principals. And one additional item. She looked at Jasper. "Harlan Sable's dismissal must be corrected in the estate and county record, in writing. The record should state that the accusations of dishonest accounting were unsupported and that his work contributed materially to uncovering the fraud." For the first time, Jasper looked genuinely surprised. "That is what this is about," he said. "Your father's name. It is one of the things this is about. You would prolong this over a sentence in a record book." Margot leaned forward slightly. "You destroyed him with a sentence in a record book." No one spoke. Judge Keene looked down at the proposal. "That correction is reasonable," he said. Jasper's solicitor whispered to him. Jasper did not answer immediately. He stared at Margot for a long time with an expression that contained anger, disbelief, and perhaps the first faint recognition that he had never understood the kind of person he was dealing with. Finally, he said, "Agreed." The revised settlement was written before they left. Colton held the signed correction concerning Harlan. "You could have demanded money for him," he said. "Money can replace what was taken," Margot said. "It cannot repair what people were taught to believe about him." She took the document. "This will not give him back 3 years. No. But he will know the truth outlived the lie." Colton looked at her, and the pride in his expression was so direct that she had to look away for a moment. They returned to Breck Hollow by the western road. On the way, they passed the first of the Greywick parcels, the old Mortlake holding. A wagon stood near the gate. The former tenants had come to inspect the property after being told they could reclaim their lease. An older man removed his hat when the Breck carriage slowed. He did not cheer. He did not bow deeply. He simply stood beside the land and looked toward them with a face that had the exhausted relief of someone who had spent too long believing a wrong thing would remain wrong forever. Margot understood then that winning the hearing had only stopped the theft. This was the harder work. putting back what could still be put back. Within the first week, Nettie Groves came to Margot in the estate office. She stood in the doorway with her hands clasped in front of her and the expression of someone who has carried a weight for a long time and is ready to set it down. She said she wanted to stay. She said she wanted to do her work properly, without fear, without divided loyalty. Margot looked at her for a long moment and then told her that her mother's leasehold was secure and would remain so. The relief that moved through Nettie's face was physical, visible in the way her shoulders dropped and her breathing changed. She nodded once and went back to her duties, and from that day forward she was one of the most dependable members of the household staff. The formal investigation moved quickly. The county magistrate, armed with Orland's parallel ledger and Margot's compiled evidence, issued warrants for the full examination of Crayle's financial records. What they found confirmed and exceeded what the ledger documented. Crayle had maintained a network of fabricated fees and false debt notices across 7 tenant families, generating income that flowed into accounts he administered jointly with Jasper. Merritt's role had been to provide the legal framework that made the theft appear procedural. The total sum diverted from Breck Hollow over 7 years was substantial enough that the magistrate described it in his preliminary report as systematic plunder conducted under the appearance of estate administration. Wyatt Fenn received compensation for his horses. It was Margot who handled the calculation, working from the breeding records Colton's father had kept and the fair market values for draft horses of that quality. When she drove to Fenn's holding with the settlement documents, the old farmer stood in his doorway and looked at the papers and then looked at her and said simply, "Thank you, Mrs. Breck." He said it the way a man says something that has been waiting inside him for a year, without ornament, without excess, just the 2 words and the weight they carried. The tenants came. Not all at once and not immediately, but over the weeks that followed. To the estate office, to the door, to the carriage gate. They came with documents and accounts, and the particular quiet dignity of people who have been wronged and are not accustomed to being heard, but who have dared to come forward because something in what they have heard suggests the house might be listening now. Margot heard them. She sat in the estate office with the new register Colton had established, and she went through each case carefully. False fees were identified and reversed. Unjust lease transfers were examined. Where the evidence supported it, families received proper remedy. The Alderton family, the first name Margot had found in the ledger on her second morning at Breck Hollow, was offered the restoration of their original lease. They accepted. When they signed the new agreement, the eldest daughter, a woman close to Margot's own age, looked at her across the table with an expression that said more than any formal gratitude could convey. One evening in late November, Opal Greer found Margot in the corridor outside the West Wing. The West Wing had been closed since Orland Breck's death. Margot had walked past its closed door every day and understood without asking that it held something she should not approach until the moment was right. Opal was carrying keys. "Mr. Breck asked me to open the West Wing this afternoon," she said. "He said you would know where to go." She did. The West Wing corridor was narrower than the rest of the house, older in its construction, with lower ceilings and plaster walls instead of stone. It felt like a different building entirely, something closer to a home than a manor, and she understood immediately why Orland Breck had chosen this wing for his private hours. She found the door at the end and opened it and went inside. It was a sitting room, not enormous, not grand, but warmly proportioned, with bookshelves and a fireplace and 2 chairs facing the window that looked out over the south garden. The books on the shelves were well handled, their spines soft from use. A reading lamp stood beside one of the chairs with the glass slightly dusty, as though it had not been cleaned, because cleaning it would mean admitting the person who used it was gone. Everything in it had the quality of a room where someone had been recently and deeply mourned. Candles were already lit. Colton was standing at the window. He turned when she came in. The candlelight caught him without the formality of the Manor's larger rooms, and he looked in that moment like the version of himself she had first seen outside the chapel on her wedding morning. Not performed, not armored, simply himself. "My father used this room," he said. He read here in the evenings. After he died, I could not come in. 14 months. Margot crossed the room slowly. She stood beside him at the window and looked out at the south garden in the dark. The dormant formal hedges, the distant lights of the tenant farms, the long parkland stretching to the iron gates. When I came to your door in the valley, Colton said, I believed I was making a strategic decision. I had convinced myself I only needed a brave woman, someone who would not collapse, someone who would hold the position beside me and give the appearance of a settled household. He was quiet for a moment. I told myself it was practical, that it had nothing to do with the fact that I had watched you for 3 days and been unable to stop. And now, she said, now I know the difference between what I told myself and what was true. He turned from the window to face her. His gray eyes were steady and open in a way that had cost him something to allow. The careful composure she had learned to read over weeks of late evenings and difficult mornings was thinner here than she had ever seen it. And beneath it was not weakness, but the kind of honesty that only becomes possible when a person has decided that being seen matters more than being safe. You walked into my house and learned it faster than I had. In 14 months, he said. You stood in my great hall and told the truth when you had every reason to stay quiet. You drove to my tenants in the rain and saw what I had missed. He paused. You gave this house back its heart, Margot, and in doing so, you gave me back mine. She stood very still. Then she reached into the pocket of her dress and took out a folded paper, the written terms they had agreed on in the first days. The conditions she had demanded, and that he had accepted without hesitation. She held it for a moment. He was watching her with an expression of absolute attentive stillness, the expression of a man who has made himself entirely present and is prepared for whatever comes next. She walked to the fireplace. She placed the paper in the flames. She watched it catch and burn and become ash. Then she turned back to him. A contract saved my father, she said, but it is not what keeps me here. He crossed the room to her, slow, deliberate, giving her every moment she needed. He stopped when they were close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cool air of the room. And he raised his hand and offered it to her, palm up. She placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers with a certainty that was neither urgent nor tentative. Simply sure, the way he was sure about everything he had decided truly mattered. He drew her closer, and she let herself move toward him, and she pressed her face against his chest and closed her eyes. She felt him rest his chin against the top of her head with the ease of a man arriving somewhere he had been trying to reach for a very long time. They stayed like that in the candlelit room of the West Wing, with the fire burning steady and the old portraits looking on and the November dark pressing gently against the windows. It was not a grand declaration. It was not a public triumph or a performance for anyone. It was two people in a warm room choosing each other without any reason left in the world to pretend, which made it more than enough. 3 months later, Breck Hollow's south lawns were open to the estate families for the first harvest celebration held in the Manor's living memory. It was a gray December afternoon with a pale winter sun that cast long blue shadows across the formal gardens. Tables had been set out on the lawns, covered in enough food to feed a village, which was precisely what they were doing. The older tenants sat in groups on the stone benches, talking with the ease of people who have been worried for a long time and are finally resting. Della Partlow was there. She caught Margot's eye across the lawn and pressed one hand briefly to her heart and looked away. Colton Sable sat near the kitchen garden door in a chair with blankets across his knees and a mug of something warm in both hands. His color was better than it had been in years. He was watching his daughter from a distance with the expression of a man who has been allowed to see something more than he feared life would give him. Margot stood on the manor steps. Colton stood beside her, not in front of her, beside her. She looked across the south lawns at the gathering, at the families who had been bled dry and were now being made whole, at the servants who had served in silence and were now being seen, at her father in his chair by the garden door, warm and cared for and watching her with quiet pride. She thought of the rain and the cottage and the dying fire and the debt collector's carriage in the lane. She thought of a man in a worn coat appearing through the rain with a bank draft already written and an offer she should not have accepted and somehow could not refuse. He thought of iron gates opening and a butler bowing, and two words that had changed the entire shape of her life. She thought of late nights in the library, and a chapel in the rain, and the warmth of a hand reaching for hers across a table covered in ledgers. She had walked into Breck Hollow with a small bag and no certainty, and no faith that the gamble would hold. She had not been rescued. She had not been given a fairy story. She had been given a house full of secrets and enemies, and a man who had hidden himself behind poverty and needed someone brave enough to see through all of it. She had done the work. She had earned the truth. Colton turned and looked at her. He raised one eyebrow, slight, dry, more warmth in it than he would ever readily admit. She looked back at him with the composure of a woman who has been through the kind of difficulty that leaves you cleaner, not harder. He offered his arm. She took it. They walked down from the steps together, into the garden, into the gathering, into the estate that was theirs. Not his or hers, but genuinely, practically, irreversibly theirs. And the winter sun came out from behind a cloud, and the voices of the gathering rose through the pale December air, and Breck Hollow glowed warmly at their backs. Margot Sable had not been rescued by a rich man's manor. She had walked into it, faced every shadow within its walls, and given a lonely man something no fortune and no estate had ever provided. Someone who chose him. Not the land, not the wealth, him. And he had given her in return something she had not known she was missing. Not safety, not comfort, not even love alone, though it was all of those things. He had given her a place to stand, a place she had earned, room by room, ledger by ledger, truth by truth, until it was hers as surely as the name she had taken and the fire she had burned and the hand she had placed in his, in the candlelit room where everything had finally, quietly become real.